I'd like to introduce Professor David Hanna from the University of Birmingham. He is the director of the Birmingham Institute for Sustainability and Climate Action. He's also the current holder of the UNESCO Chair in Water Science at Birmingham University. His research really focuses on hydroclimatology, and this kind of really breaks down to looking at how these processes play out, particularly in mountainous environments, how climate and river flow regimes may change, and river energy budgets and water temperature dynamics. So David's talk today kind of pulls together a lot of these different issues to look at how river water temperature may change under projections of future climate change. So I'll hand over to you, David.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the introduction, Sim, and the kind invitation to speak. So, as Sim says, today I'm going to be talking about protecting rivers from high water temperature extremes under global change. This research is very collaborative with a range of PhD and postdoctoral researchers at the University of Birmingham, but also colleagues at Marine Scotland Science, particularly Ian Malcolm and Faye Jackson. It's been funded largely by the Research Council, but also the European Union, the Carnegie Trust, and the Wolfson Foundation through a Royal Society fellowship. And it makes a contribution to our UNESCO chair in water science. So you might be wondering, why is he going to talk about water temperature? Why should we be interested in this topic? Well, river temperature is often referred to as the master water quality variable, controlling all of the physical, chemical, and biological processes within river systems. It's particularly important for peculiar thermic organisms, such as fish and microinvertebrates. And to give you an idea of how important that is, wild salmon production in Scotland alone is worth £80 million to the UK economy every year. Water temperature is also more broadly important in terms of socio-economic value for industrial, domestic, and recreational use. You might have heard at the end of last month, EDF were on Radio 4's Today programme talking about their worries about power generation linked to water temperature, both in terms of being able to take in cool enough water for micronuclear power plants, but also discharging warmed water from coal-fired and other thermal power stations. So river temperature is really sensitive to change, and some global work based upon observational data shows that in some regions of the world it's warming by up to 1 degree per decade. That's quite a fast rate of warming. You'll see in some regions of the world water temperature is also cooling. This is a result of greater meltwater production in these spaces. And I think that map is really nice in illustrating that the controls behind water temperature are actually quite complex. The work we've been doing in this area picked up a lot of interest during the second warmest heat wave that we've had during summer 2018 in the media, being picked up by the BBC, particularly in the context of what can we do about this in relation to climate change adaptation. In parallel with this interest in the public about water temperature, there's been a real upsurge in publications on river and stream temperature dynamics, helping to build the evidence base. So in this context, it's anticipated as our climate warms that river temperature will change. And I think as a consequence of this, it's very, very important that we understand how is water temperature going to change in terms of the space-time patterns. But perhaps even more importantly, what are the mechanisms, what are the physical processes that control the changing water temperature? Because if we gain that knowledge of how the thing works, we'll be able to transfer information to places and spaces for which we don't have data. However, there are some really significant research challenges that we need to address. We still have very few what we call energy balance studies of the fundamental processes by which rivers heat up and cool down. We have limited knowledge about thermal heterogeneity across scales, across river networks. We don't know fully about the nature and extent of a range of human impacts upon water temperature, including the role, particularly, as we're going to talk about today, of forestry. And more broadly, the sensitivity of river temperature to drivers of change, including climate, still has limited understanding. This scientific need goes alongside, and it's very nice to be talking at this forum today, an increased demand for evidence-based analysis of making choices about how we manage freshwater resources, particularly, I think, around the issues for climate change adaptation. So in that context, the aim of the presentation today is to synthesize a body of research that we've undertaken across a whole range of different scales all the way from the river reach up to the national scale, and I'll be talking about the national scale as in the whole of Scotland. And we've done that at a range of temporal scales, from looking at sub-daily minute variation all the way up to intra-annual variability. But putting this all together to understand the sensitivity of river temperature to climate and some of the other drivers of change, including people. Within this work, we're trying to address two fundamental research questions. The first of which is, how do climate, river basin properties, and hydrology interact to create thermal heterogeneity across scales? And then secondly, how do we put that research into practice to reduce high temperature extremes which are damaging to aquatic organisms and the ecosystem services provided by river systems? And if we can reduce those impacts, we can provide benefits for ecosystems and for society. If I do nothing else in this talk, what I'd like to do is to convince you that when we're talking about water temperature, we really need to think about it as a hydrological problem. It's not some nonlinear transfer function of air temperature. We need to understand how water moves through catchment systems and how that influences the water quality in terms of river temperature as it does so. Yeah? So water temperature is a hydrological problem. So I'm going to start at the small scale and build all the way up to looking at work undertaken across the whole of Scotland. So at this small scale, the work we've been doing is all about trying to understand how river temperatures heat up and cool down. And this is driven by what's called the energy budget or the heat budget. And the main gains driving energy exchanges causing the river to heat are from incident shortwave radiation, so shortwave radiation from the sun, which can be blocked by the surrounding environment, the topography and trees. Rivers can be heated by long-wave radiation emitted from anything overhanging, vegetation, again, the landscape. We can have heat gained by the process of condensation, so from water goes from a higher to a low energy state, from vapor to liquid in condensation, it releases latent heat. We can have heat being generated around the boundary of the river at the banks and bed as a result of friction, and there can be heat generated by chemical and biological processes, although these are pretty small and very difficult to measure. We have heat loss from the system by radiation being reflected at the water surface and through the water column. The river emits heat at its surface temperature as long-wave radiation, but the biggest heat loss is by, as you might expect, evaporation. As the water evaporates from the river surface, goes from liquid into vapor, it consumes the latent heat of vaporization and takes energy out of the system. We can then have energy lost or gained by sensible heat, so we can have heat being gained from a warmer atmosphere to a cooler stream, and lost from a warmer stream to a cooler atmosphere. Importantly, in these systems, we can also have energy exchanges occurring across not just the atmosphere-water interface, but also at the stream bed. Often linked to groundwater surface water interactions, we can have heat transfers occurring around the boundary of the system. The problem with rivers is that, unlike many other sort of energy balance problems, which are sort of one-dimensional, of course, rivers, as this audience knows, flow, so we have advective heat transport in and out of the channel from tributaries by precipitation, by evaporation, and in the subsurface by groundwater. So we've been undertaking for some time some very detailed micrometeorological research to understand how rivers heat up and cool down. This work has been largely undertaken in the Cairngorms, although, as I'll show in a moment, we've worked in other places in Scotland too. And we've been comparing here open Cluna moorland with deciduous near-native Scottish woodland dominated by birch. The motivation for this research is that things like the UK Forest and Water Guidelines, and indeed many practitioners have been suggesting, if you plant the riparian zone with trees, there will be benefits for river temperature. Yeah? Those statements were based upon research that was often taken just during summer, over very short periods of time, mainly in North America, not at 57 degrees north like this site, and also on commercial coniferous plantation planted right up to the edge of the stream. So we undertook some of the first work to understand what the effect of near-native Scottish woodland, the type of thing you would get from natural regeneration, might have in terms of providing potential benefits by reducing river temperature. What we've got plotted up here are diurnal cycles of river temperature, and for sites, as the red arrow shows, moving increasingly into a forested area. And what you can see is that the diurnal cycle, as we move into increasingly forested spaces, shifts and is lagged and also declines in its amplitude. And we can see when we compare August with January that the temperature differences between the warmer open moorland and the more forested sites are greater in summer than they are in winter. We were able to look at the energy exchange processes by which the river heats up and cools down using what is quite a remarkable 7-year high-quality data set, which I've just got plotted here, data for spring and summer, which compares heat fluxes in the moorland site with those in the forested site. The size of the bars represent the size of the fluxes. What we can see here is that net radiation, as you might expect, is the greatest heat source, and latent heat driven by evaporation is the greatest heat sink. But also the heat flux at the stream bed can be quite important, and this site in the moorland had quite strong groundwater surface water interactions, and actually the groundwater provided a source of cooling during summer, but also a source of warming, not plotted here, during the winter. What's notable is that all the heat fluxes are higher in magnitude and much more variable for the moorland and the forested site, a much more less buffered site compared to the forest. And the red ellipses represent the fact that the differences were reduced under cool, overcast, calm, and damp prevailing weather conditions, and the differences were conversely greatest when we had clear skies, warm temperatures, and very windy conditions. So really taking this longer-term observation data set allowed us not just to understand the heat fluxes, but how they change under different prevailing weather conditions. We also undertook work in terms of the heat exchange processes in other landscapes, and working this time in the western Scottish Highland in Lochard, which is should have said that the Cairngorm site is a subarctic site. This is a moist maritime site. We looked at the heat exchange processes there, and in this case compared open grass moorland with semi-natural deciduous woodland, again dominated by birch, and then commercial coniferous plantations, Sitka spruce, planted in 1975. And what the bars here show are the total amount of energy exchange, and you can read the thermometrics on the bottom of each of the plots. And what I want you to take away from this slide is that the greatest differences in terms of heat exchange processes are not between the open site and the semi-natural site, but they're between commercial coniferous woodland site and the other two. Yeah? So the message from this slide is that planting riparian forests can change the energy exchange, but it depends what type of trees you plant. We then went on to use that rich sort of empirical data set about how rivers heat up and cool down to undertake some modeling experiments to understand the processes further. We used what's called a Lagrangian particle tracking model, where we take a parcel of water, we solve the energy balance, and we move it down the system, and in this case, into an area of increasing forest. We characterized a real forested area in the Gurnet Burn in Aberdeenshire, again, using these hemispheric fisheye lenses to give us a measure of canopy density, and then ran this particle tracking model. What I've got plotted here is distance downstream over a kilometre, time on this axis here, and the colours give us the temperatures. What you can see is that midday, sort of about a kilometre down, the stream temperature is 2 degrees or thereabouts lower than it is at the upstream site at the same time. Now, this is a particle tracking model, so what it allowed us to see was to look at the energy balance processes to see how the river is heating up and cool down, but also the fact that this water was moving through the system. And actually what we found was that unlike much of the conventional wisdom or statements that have been made, the forest actually wasn't causing the river to cool. Actually what this was these were parcels of water that were generated during the evening, overnight, that had been rooted down here and were actually had lost heat as a consequence of being generated then. And when we solved the energy balance, actually, there wasn't cooling in the stretch which we had the vegetation. So the takeaway message from this slide is we need to understand the hydraulics, and we also need to think quite carefully about the upstream conditions. Right? The upstream site here was deforested and lacking vegetation, so perhaps we need to think, given what we say here in terms of the energy exchange processes, not being able to cool the stream, we need to think about the upstream boundary conditions and how we might influence the water temperatures introduced. So we also undertook some more modelling experiments, this time some sensitivity-based work, which looked at the amount of riparian forest density cover from a very open canopy at 10% all the way up to 90%. But what we did in this experiment was to rotate the river network through 180 degrees to look at different channel orientations. We also then ran the modeling work for both a high and low velocity scenario. And what these results show is that the different colored lines represent the different channel orientations for the different fisheye lens photographs of the different canopy densities. And what we can see is, so we have a very open canopy. There's no difference between the different sites in terms of channel orientation. And when we have quite dense canopies, between 70 and 90%, we mainly have heat losses and not too much difference between the different channel orientations. But where we have canopy densities between 30 and 60%, we actually see quite marked differences in terms of the amount of energy that's received by the stream, depending upon the channel orientation. Where if we have planting on the southerly slopes in the northern hemisphere, that results in much more shading being cast over the stream and reduced energy inputs. So the takeaway from this slide is channel orientation is really important, and what we were able to demonstrate from this work is actually that targeted planting in the right places may have greater benefits in terms of being able to impact on the stream temperature if we plant at appropriate points in the network. We also found that when we looked at the hydraulics, that hydraulic residence time was very important, and with slower flows there was more time to accumulate or dissipate heat, and with faster flows there was less time for those heat exchange processes to be effective. We've also done some more, oh, the mouse pointers. Over here. Get it to go. Nope. Here we go. Right. Yes, so we've also done some more complex modeling. So this is using a fully 3D model, Delft 3D. And what we've done here was to model river temperature across a complex river system. Now, as you watch this animation run, you might be able to see that roundabouts at solar noon, there's actually a decrease in water temperature, and you see these freshets of water coming down. This isn't a site from Scotland, but I've put it in intentionally to show you the importance of the controlling hydrology. This is a site located in northern Sweden, and there's a glacier at the top of the river system here. So what you find is that over the day, the water sources switch, and we have, as the temperatures increase and we get more meltwater contribution, we have cold water coming into the system and decreasing the water temperature. So the takeaway message from this is, although we need to understand the heat exchange processes, we actually need to understand the hydrological processes too, in terms of that water comes from in the first instance. So to build on this empirical and modeling work we'd done, we had a European Union funded project which used the types of detailed micrometeorological data we've been using before, but coupled that with drone-based imagery and also data pulled from a whole bunch of different GIS metric databases for upscaling to feed into a process-based river temperature model called heat source, which allowed us to look at river temperature dynamics across a range of spatial and temporal scales. So we used the drone imagery, and we hoped this would be able to give us spatially distributed data of river temperature at the reach and indeed across the whole river network. But actually, we found out that the thermal imagery data that we got from the drone actually was relatively correct within a scene, but absolutely wrong in terms of the temperature values themselves. What we've got plotted up here is the flight temperatures in the black line, and the blue dots are observations made in the stream. And what you can see is in 2 out of those 3 flights that the water temperatures in the stream are quite different from those that came from the drone. And there's a paper which explains the reasons behind this, but in a nutshell it comes down to issues with the camera and issues with the changing meteorological conditions influencing the sensor. So we weren't able to get absolute values of temperature, but I would say that the thermal imagery was very useful for looking at relative patterns across the individual scenes, and we're currently doing some work on thinking about how we can stitch these scenes better together using a de-drifting method to provide provide something closer to the real temperatures we observe in the river system. But saying that, the drone work wasn't sort of all bad in that we were able to use something called structure from motion, where the drone flies along and is able to take the optical image, which we can then process, and because the drone can see sort of obliquely, in this case, under the riparian cover, the riparian trees, we can get a bare earth model, a full surface terrain model, and by differencing the two, get the tree heights with a very high level of accuracy. We were then able to plug those tree heights into the modeling work that we did using heat source to look at the stream temperature response. There's a couple of papers that look at a whole bunch of different ways of characterizing riparian trees, from sort of taking polygons to using LiDAR data, etc. And the punchline is that the drone-based imagery provided the best resolution. And what you can see from these plots at the top here, where we've got, just for simplicity in this case, the observations in blue, the structural motion model, and a model with no trees in it, structural motion in the green, and the no trees model in the red, is that the structural motion-based characterization of trees provides the best fit. And we can see in this case that as we move down 2 kilometers over reach through an increasingly forested section, we have a stream temperature reduction of about 1.5 degrees. All of the modeling work we've done is quite complex. So what we've been working on recently is providing some prioritization mapping tools based upon a simplified version of the physically based modeling that we've been done for different tree heights, different channel geometries, different channel orientations, and different channel orders, which represent hydrology and hydraulics. As I'll show you at the end, making these available to river managers to make decisions about planting. So I'm now going to jump to the much larger scale to talk about the work we've been doing in terms of modeling river temperature across the whole of Scotland by creating something called the River Temperature Monitoring Network. So this network was based upon observations that were done across 13 of the most significant and famous salmon streams. And we, across those river systems, we distributed our observations in such a way that it covered the full environmental range that we get across the whole of Scotland. So something to talk about perhaps over coffee is the way in which we designed the sampling. We delivered this very much in a participatory monitoring approach, working with Scottish Government, but really importantly, working with the fisheries trusts and boards. So we designed the monitoring network with Scottish Government. We developed the standard operating procedures and calibrated all our loggers that went out into the environment. We then delivered that through the fisheries trusts and boards. They helped with maintenance, downloading. We were involved then in quality control, data storage, providing the publications, and providing data back for decision making. So we have 223 loggers, 50-minute data, and we now have more than 70 million observations in the database, entirely enabled through the local trusts and boards. We were then able to use those data in statistical modeling based on generalized linear models, but including a Bayesian framework which describes the river network, to be able to model river temperature across those streams, but then do that across the whole of Scotland. So those models, and this is a space-time model, a dynamic model, picked out the roles of changing air temperature, location, but also landscape characteristics, particularly riparian woodland, in driving stream temperature response. These model predictions allow us to look at the spatial variability, but also climatic sensitivity, and we've provided them as tools to river managers. So we used that statistical model to produce a space-time model of river temperature, and we're running it here for an observed period during summer of 2018, which is the second warmest heat wave we've got on record. What you've got here is the probability distribution of river temperatures across Scotland in relation to the changing air temperature on the bottom, and some really important threshold for Atlantic salmon in terms of the level at which they become stressed and the level at which it becomes lethal. What you can see over summer 2018 is that the river temperatures get close to levels that would stress the fish, and we're able to model that for the whole of the country. And we can see the hotspots which get the warmest. Just to flag, 2018 is used as a benchmark for the type of climate that we'd expect every other year by 2050. So having built that model, validated and observational data, recently we've been sort of running a whole bunch of climate scenarios to look at future river temperature across Scotland by 2050 using the UK CP18's ensemble. We drove it by maximum daily air temperature, and we modeled all the streams apart from river order 1. What you can see is there's some variation between the different scenarios, but in relation to those thresholds, by 2050, there's large parts of Scotland which will be getting to those levels that will be causing stress for fisheries. We've used these large-scale maps to work with a range of organisations to think about how we target riparian tree planting at the larger scale in terms of climate change adaptation. Just before I get to the conclusion slides, I just wanted to flag the fact that all of this work has been done in very strong collaboration with Scottish Government, with the Fisheries Trusts and boards, and we've been serving to make sure that the research gets into the real world through advice pamphlets, by making all our data openly available through Marine Scotland's National Marine Plan Interactive, and most recently been able to provide to different landowners clipped out maps of their individual river basins with information on river temperatures there. As a consequence of that, that's had some real world impact in that we think we may be responsible for planting 200,000 trees. The Guardian thought it was a million trees. We've also been involved with Scottish Natural Heritage, or now Nature Scot, in terms of working on their woodland restructuring plans, and the research has also underpinned many applications towards the Biodiversity Challenge Fund, including those for the Cairngorm National Park. So to end, I hope in the presentation I have shown you that river temperature is a really important water quality variable. It's sensitive to both natural and human drivers of change. In relation to this forum, there are different data requirements and different approaches required over different scales. We can potentially leverage new technologies, both for observation and analysis. We can use process-based models to improve mechanistic understanding and think about management impacts at the rather local scale, from the site to the river reach. Across larger scales, we can use statistical models to look at the wider patterns at the catchment to the regional scale. That can inform climate change adaptation strategies. In terms of where I think we need to go from here, we need to think about how we can integrate that fine-scaled process understanding with the larger scale statistical network-based models. And if we can do that, we can better understand how river temperature works in terms of advancing our blue skies knowledge, but also to help underpin robust evaluations of what the potential of management interventions might be. And I think we require that if we're going to really make a step change in our knowledge of how climate, land use, and other drivers of change influence stream temperature, which should inform practice and ultimately yield benefits for ecosystems and for society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. So we'll pick up all the questions at the end in the Q&A session. If you've got questions related to David's talk, if you can put them into the Slido, and then we'll pick them up from there. Next up is Clare Deasy from Northumbria Water. So Clare is going to be talking about something which is on my programme, which I put down, which was a mistake. So Clare's talking about climate solutions, data and evidence, with a focus on two of the local rivers. So I'll hand over to you, Clare.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Hi everybody, so obviously you had me chair the session this morning. I wasn't intending to talk again, but Jenny Nyker from Mont MacDonald, who was going to give this talk, had problems with her trains yesterday, so she's not been able to come. So I'm presenting a project which is a project that I sponsor and I manage within the company, and Mont MacDonald lead on this project for us. I'm just thinking if we've got anyone here from within the Weir or the Tees. I don't think we have, but if anybody knows a lot about this, forgive me for talking about it. Hopefully I'll put across the right perspective. It is a partnership project that we're working on. We are trying to look at opportunities for improving water quality within the catchment, working through catchment and nature-based solutions as alternatives to end-of-pipe treatment. We've chosen two catchments that we're focusing on currently. These are operational scales, so multiple water bodies. There's 10 in the Skern, which is a tributary of the River Tees, flowing north of Darlington and flowing into the Tees south of Darlington, and the Brownie in the River Wear, which is 9 water bodies, and it flows into the River Wear not far from here, at Sunderland Bridge. These catchments are a mix of urban and rural, but principally the Brownie's on the edge of Durham, Skern's on the edge of Darlington, villages, agriculture, and lowland type agriculture around here. I mean, it's a type of landscape that you see outside the window that you might have seen if you came on the train into here. So we are thinking about the contributions that we have into these catchments in terms of sewage treatment works discharges, both those that are numerically consented, so bigger ones that have better data, and there's also a number of smaller what we call descriptive works where we have a permit to discharge, but we know less about the quality of what's coming in from those smaller treatment works. Normally, we would do end-of-pipe treatment, so we would look at removing, particularly we're thinking about phosphate, so phosphorus, remove phosphorus from those discharges to try and improve water quality, and our target is towards Water Framework Directive to try and get towards good status to play our part in that. We would like to think about alternative, more sustainable ways of doing that, rather than these really carbon and energy, chemical-intensive ways of treating that wastewater. So we have a project that's running in these two catchments currently, and we are intending to look at investing by 2025. That's the idea as part of this current asset management plan. The little tables on there just show you the type of permits that we're trying to get to for these treatment works. So within the Brownie, we've got 7 sewage treatment works. None of them, apart from Brownie treatment works at the bottom, have any phosphorus removal currently. So we're looking at a sort of £50 million investment plan potentially in the Brownie to improve river water quality. In the Skern, we've got 7 treatment works, and we've got 4 that we're looking at currently in the upper catchment. Again, none of those have phosphorus removal. That's potentially another £12 million. And we're thinking, is there a better way to invest this type of investment in the environment rather than just removing phosphate as a single indicator? Can we do more within the catchment, working in partnership? Can we think about multiple benefits? Can we think about shared objectives? So we're looking at a range of opportunities within these projects. Obviously, we're comparing everything to what might be end-of-pipe treatment that would be the solution. What would an alternative solution look like? And how can we best optioneer a solution to understand how we can present a business case for doing something differently within these catchments? We're thinking about wetland solutions as part of that, but we're also thinking about ways that we could work with agricultural landowners, how we could work with land managers, how we could think about managing other sources once we become aware of those within the catchment. Integrated constructed wetlands were talked about this morning in the context of nutrient neutrality. We're looking at those in terms of how effective they might be for phosphorus as an end-of-pipe solution, potentially immediately downstream of a treatment works, but also potentially at catchment scale. The Skern catchment itself is in an area of low-lying land which was previously, a long time ago, fenland. And there is a large-scale aspiration from the Tees Partnership and the Brightwater Partnership, a landscape partnership around wetland restoration at scale. So we're interested in understanding what part we could play in that. We're looking at catchment permitting, which for those of you that don't know what that might be, it's just a way of thinking differently about how a water company is regulated on its discharges. So rather than it being immediately downstream for treatment works, can we think about all of the inputs that go into a catchment, the role we play in that, and that we have a different type of regulatory mechanism to encourage us to work in a different way? And we're obviously thinking about partnership approaches. So how can we work with others? How can we work with all of the stakeholders that you represent here today? How can we bring together shared interests? So we're working within the catchment-based approach to do that. We're thinking in an integrated way. So obviously, we have a driver to help improve water quality for phosphorus removal. But we know that there are many other things that are important in these catchments that we're trying to get towards. Interestingly, water temperature is not something that we have thought about within the Skern or the Brownie. Not currently a water quality driver for us, but I'm interested to have a conversation with David on that over lunch. We are thinking about those other pressures, and the Skern is also a nutrient neutrality area that has come in for the Tees. Until now, nitrogen has not been a driver for any of the work that we might do. Our focus has been on phosphorus, so that's an interesting change for us. We are bringing together a number of different data and evidence sources within the project. We are obviously using the Environment Agency's water quality data, but we're supplementing that with our own data that we're collecting within rivers. We've had Lancaster University undertake a monitoring program for us, where they'll be monitoring at different locations through the catchments to understand, what's happening other than at our discharges, where we've got quite good data, and at the EA's monitoring points. We're using the source apportionment GIS models, both the older model, which was produced by water companies and the Environment Agency, to think about who's responsible for the different pollutant sources that are coming into a catchment. We're looking at that particularly for phosphorus. There is now a new model. We were concerned about the uncertainty in the old model. We're quite concerned about the suitability of the new model, let's just say, to allow us to apportion that. So what we're trying to do is take the data that we're collecting and recalibrate that model to help us understand more about what's the right thing to do where. We're also trying to bring in that third-party data and evidence, so from partners. So that's both in terms of ecological information, say river fly monitoring, but also in terms of, we know that this landowner is doing this here, this is the type of information we have. So we're trying to pull together those different types of data sources through the partnership conversations that we're having. Probably enough on the data and evidence. We have a number of monitoring points through the catchment. So I mentioned Lancaster University have been doing this, and this is the type of information that we have been collecting. So the map shows some circles. Those circles represent phosphate concentrations of soluble reactive phosphate at different locations in the river. We have a number of treatment works through this section of the catchment, and you can see at the top red spot at the top, we have a treatment works just upstream of that, as expected. This type of low flow information, we're seeing a big red blob downstream of that. However, we do know that there's some of the headwaters are diluting some of those other sources, and we did have, obviously it's been a dry winter for us here in the northeast. The Skern is an interesting catchment because it's groundwater fed. So we have managed to capture 2 points up there in December and February, which look like they're higher flows, but actually that's not rainfall fed, that's groundwater fed. And the Brownie, we didn't manage to get any high flows whatsoever in the whole of the monitoring that we did from sort of late autumn through to the summer. So, it's difficult to capture the additional data. It's quite intensive, it's quite expensive. We know it's valuable, but actually there are still limitations in terms of what we can collect on a project type campaign basis. These outputs show some of the SAGIS information and the type of information that those models are giving us. Obviously, the models are only as good as the data sets that feed into those. So the source apportionment GIS SAGIS uses information from the Psychic phosphorus model, and it uses information from FarmScoper that's looking at agricultural inputs. It's using the Environment Agency's in-river data, and it's using our sewage treatment works discharges. It's got a very good representation of our discharges as a water company into the river. The other sources are much more uncertain. And this new model has, we think, hugely overestimated the role of intermittent discharges, so those storm overflows and misconnections into the catchment. You'll see actually the grey shading within the pie charts, sometimes 50%, sometimes more. We know from our observations within the catchments and what we in partners understand that those are unrealistic and are very different to the previous model. So these are the tools that are being produced for us to look at investing millions of pounds in the right improvements. So we're questioning that and looking at weight of evidence to understand what are the right things to do where and what more data sources do we need to do that. The type of outputs that we're looking at, so the project's currently in optioneering stage. Jenny has pulled together this slide which shows some of the contribution teams, what we're aiming for in terms of good status, in terms of how much phosphorus we want to remove per year, and actually what we could do in terms of what we could remove from our treatment works. We know that there's a really big challenge in some of these catchments, even the Skern, for example, that's mainly rural at this part. We know agriculture has a big contribution, and it's actually, even if we were to do everything that we could and get to the technically achievable limit for phosphate for our treatment works, we still wouldn't be able to get the water bodies to good status. We need agriculture to be doing its part alongside. And the final slide, there's sort of three points that Jenny had wanted us to draw out here. So one is around the quality of the data. So we all need better data. We're trying to build a conceptual model of what's happening in the Skern. We know that we need better data, but how much is enough? And how can we work together to gather the right data sets and do that cost effectively? we need the local knowledge on what's happening on the ground. We need to actually get much smarter at working together to pull together these different data sets in different ways and bring together that community of practice, as Dave likes to talk about, to work out how we can do that and use that for decision making. And we need the evidence to understand what it is we want to do. We need to design those monitoring programs and bring together the right data. And we need to do that together. You know, we as a water company have bigger responsibilities for monitoring. We need to integrate that with the environment agencies and these other data platforms that are gathering information and that we talked about this morning. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. Okay, so if you can, as I said before, if you can put the questions into the Slido. If there's questions on there that you like the look of, please upvote them. We'll kind of work through the questions that have had the most number of votes. So next up is Richard Kingston. I can give that to you. Just click in. I'll take that one. So Richard is going to be talking about the climate just data sets, and I'll leave it to you to introduce those.
Okay, thank you. Right, well, thank you for inviting me. This is a fairly long-term project that I'm going to talk to you about. So it was originally funded by Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and we worked with Paul Sayers and partners who've done a lot of the flood risk modelling. And this was put together with my colleague Sarah Lindley, who's Professor of Geography in Manchester. So basically what climate justice is, it's a little bit different to what we've been hearing about so far. It takes a more socio-economic approach to looking at flood risk. So not just thinking about where that flood water, and also heat. So I was going to talk mainly about flooding today, but also it accounts for heat, temperature data as well. But thinking about the fact that which communities get impacted the most. So you might get a lot of flooding, say for example in Cheshire, but I never see that as being much of a problem because there's a lot of affluent people live in Cheshire. They can afford to spend money to fix their property. They can put up defences around their property. Equally, if you go into somewhere like certain neighbourhoods in Hull, some very deprived areas, they can't afford to sort of adapt their properties and things. So we take this focus looking around climate justice or injustice as the data starts showing you. So that's combining socio-economic data with climate data. So the main aim really of what when we built this back, I think the original version was 2014, and then we did updates in 2018, and we're about to launch some more updates in the coming weeks. It's all about sharing knowledge about who is socially vulnerable to climate change and why. So we built a mapping tool, but there's also a large resource here on this website with a lot of case studies and information that we've worked with local authorities around the country, with the Environment Agency, to focus in on particular neighbourhoods, with the view to having this toolkit available to local authorities and other organisations to use it to help them support the development of adaptation action plans. So it's really focusing on the kind of the personal, the social and environmental factors, explain why, you know, as I said earlier, you know, a flood in Cheshire has very, very different impacts to a flood in Hull. Might be the same level of flooding, but from a socio-economic point of view, that impact is very different. And that's the focus. I'm not saying that those people in Cheshire are any less deserving of having flood defences of things, but it's about how can communities respond, particularly when you account for deprivation in those neighbourhoods. So we take, in terms of the source data, we've got what we'd call the flood hazard, we've got flood exposure, and then flood vulnerability, and it's this here that we're really kind of interested in, about who is most vulnerable to flooding. And that creates, what we developed is what we call a neighbourhood scale set of metrics. So focusing on particular neighbourhoods. Some of this is done at what's called an MSOA, a middle super output area, and an LSOA, a lower super output area. They are census geography boundaries. You all live in one of these. An LSOA is kind of like a neighbourhood level scale. You go up to MSOA and eventually they aggregate up to local authority wards. So basically using Sayers UK Future Flood Explorer and the data that comes out of that to feed into this. And then we've got a whole set of drivers. Exogenous drivers around climate change, and then things that we really can't, well, I suppose you could say we do have some impact on them, but these sort of endogenous drivers around flood risk management. So things like, you know, when we make decisions about where new housing development should take place, that's a decision that we have some control over that. The fact that we're allowing lots of housing to be built on floodplains isn't necessarily a great thing. We can control that, but that is something that feeds in then to the exposure and the vulnerability of those communities living in that particular area. And again, we've got this key metric that we developed, this neighbourhood flood vulnerability index. So if you go onto the Climate Just website, you can zoom into any particular neighbourhood across England, Scotland, Wales, and see what that value is, how great the risk is within your local neighbourhood. Another one then as well is the social, so I'll show you these shortly. There's the neighbourhood flood vulnerability index, and then the social flood risk index. This is driven by a whole set of data sets as well. So we've got ones around susceptibility. So we know, for example, that very young people, very old people are more susceptible to flood and heat. And also health. So people who are, maybe have limiting long-term illness or have a disability that stops them being able to be as mobile, are more susceptible to climate change risks, whether that's flooding or increased temperatures. We've all experienced some fairly hot weather earlier this year. We had a lot more people having to go to hospital, particularly with respiratory illnesses, whether they're very young children or elderly populations. You remember, I thought it was about 10 years ago, but someone told me that it was about 20 years ago in Paris. There were those when there were excess deaths in Paris when a lot of elderly people were left at home and their families went off to the south of France on holiday. So we know that high temperatures have a real impact on particularly on elderly people. We then have a whole other set, sort of like a basket of data that's within each one of these verticals. So things like ability to prepare for a flood, and this is driven by data around income, information use, local knowledge, the type of property that you live in. So if you're in rented accommodation, it's not you don't have any control about how you might adapt maybe the front garden and things. Things like ability to respond, again, is these kind of income, information, knowledge, but also physical mobility. Can you actually get out and away? Can you move away temporarily from your property if it's going to be at flood risk? Ability to recover as well, and obviously being able to clean up your property. Do you live in a place where have you actually been able to afford insurance? So if you can't afford insurance, you're going to really struggle in terms of ability to recover. Things like information use as well. So some of the indicators of that are things like is English. If English isn't your first language, you can often struggle if material information isn't provided in your first language in terms of how you use information to understand whether that's preparing, responding or recovering. And again, physical mobility. Also again, a set of characteristics around community support. So often if there's been a flood or high temperatures, we saw that over the recent couple of months where we had high temperatures, local people moving out into temporary accommodation where they can provide cooling and things to reduce the temperature. Also know things like if you've had previous experience of a direct flood experience, if you've been flooded before, you are maybe more prepared for when that happens again. Service availability and social networks. This doesn't mean Facebook and Twitter, this means more like your local community. Do you have a network? Are the local authorities kind of providing facilities and services that mean that you can get some support if you need to move out or move away from where you currently live? So all of these are kind of essentially census-based kind of data or Office for National Statistics data. So it just gives you an idea of things like service availability. So we've got things like emergency services exposed to flooding. So we mapped things like if the ambulance station gets flooded and you need to go to hospital, that ambulance isn't going to be able to get to you. So what's the percentage of, when we look at this at a very local area? Care homes exposed to flooding. These are just some of them. We've got more GPs. So a lot of those, suddenly service availability is removed. Suddenly those services are not available to come out and help if you need them. Other ones around social networks. So single pensioner households tend to be people who are more isolated. They don't have a wider family around them. Again, at a higher, therefore they're more vulnerable to some kind of climate impact. Lone parent households, again with dependent children. Another one that we've got in social networks is school-age children. So we combine all of this data. Lots of other data on that. I mean, you go on the website, you can see all of this, you can map all of this. So you can drill down, as well as having this social flood vulnerability index, you can also then drill down and see the individual layers of each one of these data sets. So you can zoom in. If you're developing some kind of adaptation plan for your local community, maybe you want to make sure if you're producing material that's going to go out to those communities and you've got an area with a high or low level of proficiency in English, and maybe you need to understand more about what's the first language of those people to make sure your material that's being sent out to those communities, they can read it in their own language. We've got a whole range of other data sets here. So this all kind of underpins the vulnerability maps that we produce. This is just giving some sort of summary highlights. So we know, for example, at the moment around 6.5 million, this was on the 2011 census, so whether this will have changed much when we find out next year. 6.4 million people living in flood-prone areas. That's increase to 10.8 million based on the UKCP 2080 predictions. 1.5 million of those people are living in what we'd call socially vulnerable neighbourhoods. So over 50% of these socially vulnerable people are living in 10 local authority areas. So this is quite concentrated in particular parts of the country, as you can see with these darker blue areas. So Hull comes out as one of the most vulnerable places in terms of the impacts of flooding, whether that's particularly around tidal flooding, but also river flooding as well. We have two ways of doing this. And these are the top 5% of neighbourhoods that are most vulnerable, in the blue from coastal flooding and in the shades of green to fluvial on the floodplain. This is what it shows you if you look at the social flood risk map. So again, we've got areas around here that are quite low lying, but particularly if you zoom the online, the web tool allows you to zoom into these areas. Hull comes out pretty badly, and also South Wales in the valleys and parts of Northern Ireland as well. So that's a local authority level or at an MSOA level. If you do that, then if you weight this individual level using the individual population data, we can then see more highlighted concentrations based on population. So because we've had this around, how many people have actually heard of this or used it? Oh, that's good. Only 3 of you, 4 of you. So I'm not teaching to you're all sat here going, I've heard of this 5 years ago. What are you talking about? So just to give you a kind of flavour of who is using this. So we know it's very widely used across all of the UK. Climate Ready Clyde used it, so it's fed into, provided the evidence base for these kind of organisations to produce what we'd call generally the sort of adaptation action plans. Get a lot of use out of local authorities and environmental charities and local groups within neighbourhoods. It's been used within particular communities. It's used quite heavily by charities when they're bidding for scarce resources. There's not a lot of funding around at the moment, is there? But in terms of bidding for funding to try and get extra cash to support adaptation plans, or maybe it's social housing providers if they're wanting to put in adaptation measures in their neighbourhoods. And the Environment Agency as well, because they were partly involved in the early workshops to help build this. So it's an ever-evolving thing, although we originally got the funding from GRF. We've just had a bit of funding off Friends of the Earth, and with that we've been able to revise. We've got the data, we've just not put it on the website yet. We're working on that at the moment. So it's improving, it's changing. Obviously, we'll hopefully be able to get some funding to adapt it again and update it with the 2022 census. We're going to be changing at the moment. It uses the previous UKCP data. We need to update that with the 2018 data as well. And we're also going to sort of relaunch the whole thing, because on my next slide, I think, the one after the next one, I'll talk a little bit about some funding we've got at the moment through NERC that will allow us to expand and build this, and hopefully you can get involved in helping us steer the future. So it's a sort of, as I say, we're 2014, 2018, and we're about to launch some of the updated socioeconomic data. So we've Friends of the Earth allowed us to sort of trawl through Office for National Statistics data, and we'll be updating that very shortly. If you've never used it before, this is kind of what it looks like. If you go onto the mapping tool, there's a whole set of data under flooding. We've also got heat. Fuel poverty is turned off at the moment. We've got government agency maps. They're things like the Flood Zone 2, Flood Zone 3. So there's EA data, SEPA data, NRA, Natural Resources Wales, and then some admin data, which is kind of like the boundaries. So you can kind of get an idea of, on here, the most acute areas. So this is my penultimate slide. So anyway, it's freely available. Anyone can use it. We used to have a login system, but we've removed that at the moment, so you can go on there and see all the resources, and you can play around the maps. You can print out a map as a PDF, put it in your report, etc. And finally, I just want to finish off with a bit of an advert, really. So at the moment, where I'm leading what's called the NERC Digital Solutions Programme. So that's an £8 million investment by NERC. So basically, they've realised we've got 40 petabytes of data, and only environmental scientists and physical geographers, probably a lot of you in the room, use that data. And they want to connect that data to a whole lot of other data to support decision making. So we're about to, I keep saying to my colleagues, we're going on tour. We're going to 14 locations. I don't know how well you can see these, from Aberdeen in the north right down to Plymouth in the south, across to Belfast. And we're going to be running workshops asking you, how do you currently use data? What software do you use? And how might all of this 40 plus petabytes of data help you do the kind of things you do? So we're not building something like Climate Just and going, da-da, there you go, use it, isn't it brilliant? We're starting off by saying, right, what are your problems? What data are you missing? I heard someone earlier mention the soil data. That's all in the NERC, one of the NERC data centres. So bringing all that data together into a single location, and we are building analytical toolkits that will sit on top of that. So it does say Eventbrite goes live today. Because I'm here, it's going live tomorrow. But if you follow us on Twitter or talk to me during lunch, whatever, it'd be great if you could turn up to one of these around the country. It's free. We'll give you lunch. And if you're really interested, you can come and spend time working with us in our new building. I saw my minute, probably 2 minutes ago. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So next up we have Julia Knapp from Department of Earth Science at Durham University, who just needs a mic.
Are you okay with that on your jumper? If not, how does it work?
Are you okay to swap slides? I don't know your exact title.
That's all right. So we're going to spiral back to catchment management and talk about sources. So it's just going to be a 5-minute highlight topic, so bear with me. It'll be very brief. So when we are looking at contamination of agrochemicals or any types of pesticide nutrients in streams, we notice, or we would like to reduce those, and what we notice is that we see them that they vary a lot over time, which indicates that different sources in the catchment are contributing to stream flow at different times. So if we want to apply land management practices, it would be really good if we knew where these sources were in the catchment and which sources are being activated at different times, because otherwise we'd be spending lots of money just trying to manage every part of the catchment rather than the problematic parts of it. Usually, if we want to do that, we need to build complicated models to identify these flow paths and those sources, or we need to collect lots and lots of data, and then we analyze the data and we find out what's happening at the moment, but that won't be valid anymore in maybe 10 years' time because of land use change or because of climate change. So what I'm proposing, or something I've been working on with collaborators in the last few years, is an approach of using natural solutes as source indicators in the catchment. One of the ways that what we do in catchment science is we're looking at vertical sources by something called concentration-discharge relationships. So rather than plotting concentration over time, we plot concentration against discharge. And depending on where the vertical source of that solute is in the catchment, we see different types of patterns. So these solutes will either plot along a line that's upward slanting or one that's downward slanting. And the reason for that is simple, because if we look at calcium as example for a solute that's found in the deeper groundwater, when flow is low in the streams, it means that most of the stream is being fed by groundwater, which is rich in calcium or in all other groundwater-derived solutes. However, when our flow increases because it's wetter conditions, a lot of flow comes through the shallow subsurface, and thus that's diluting our calcium in the stream. On the other hand, for solutes that are located in the shallow surface soil layers, we can see the opposite effect. So at low flows, dry conditions, we have low concentrations of those solutes because water doesn't travel through the shallow subsurface. However, when it gets wetter, that water goes through the shallow layers and contributes to stream flow, increasing concentrations of those solutes in the stream. So these are natural solutes that are found in the catchment by itself. And we can use this approach maybe to understand where a source for an agrochemical is. Is it a deeper source, so a legacy contribution, or is it something that's been applied recently? But we can go even further, because ideally we'd like to identify the lateral sources, the lateral places where this water is coming from. From that, we can look at the temporal changes in these concentration discharge relationships. Up on the left, you can see those concentration discharge relationships for a couple of solutes. The top two are groundwater-derived solutes. The different colored lines represent different hydrologic events, different rain events. And for those groundwater solutes, we don't see a lot of variability because they're from the deeper parts. But for those ones from the shallow subsurface, so in this case potassium nitrate, we see a lot of variability over time. So every rain event is different, indicating that water is coming from a different source in the catchment to the stream. And we can use those solutes as a tracer to understand where the water comes from. It's really relatively cost efficient and relatively easy to do. We can also look at how these contributions change with wetness, because we know when the catchment wets up, the area that's connected to the stream expands out from the stream laterally and basically increases to comprise the whole catchment. So by looking at these mobilization mechanisms and looking at what solutes are being mobilized when, naturally occurring solutes again, we can use those as fingerprints for different lateral sources of our catchment, of our contaminants, and also about the parts where we should be targeting our management practices. So this is a very academic approach to this, and if you have any kind of catchments that you think this would be useful to apply, do come talk to me over lunch. Yeah, it would be great to discuss. Otherwise, you can contact me by email. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Julia. Glen? Next up is Glen McGregor. He's a professor in Department of Geography here at Durham. He's a climatologist, and I'm trying to remember more things from his CV to fill the space as he walks up. If you can just click that on the shot.
Good to go.
Okay. So Glen is going to give us a very quick introduction to climate change science. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Kia ora, as we would say in my home country, New Zealand. David, excellent talk. Thank you very much. Good to see former PhD students doing so well. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm talking to a pretty sophisticated audience, so please excuse the simplicity of what's to follow. I think it's safe to say the climate is changing. I'm going to run a very quick animation. You're all familiar with the so-called warming stripes developed by Ed Hawkins down at Reading University. We've developed some for Durham and animated them up to only 2018. We need to update them to 2021. So you can see very clearly the blues are low temperatures and the reds are relatively high temperatures. So as you see, as we track from 1850 through to 2018, something is definitely happening to the local climate. And of course, this reflects much wider scale changes across the UK, Europe, and indeed the planet. So it resonates with what the IPCC has found in its most recent report, published just a year or so ago. And this shows the major regions where there is clear evidence of increases in temperature. The little black dots indicate the confidence in that evidence. So there's lots of evidence pointing to discernible changes in temperature. You can see from the majority of the globe's surface, clear increases in temperature evident. Not so wide-ranging geographically in terms of unequivocal changes in observed heavy precipitation, and you'll notice just single dots in most cases for most of the regions, indicating much lower confidence in terms of the trend of heavy precipitation. Nevertheless, there is clear evidence for some regions that changes are occurring. And this is the same for agricultural and ecological drought. Again, some regions have experienced pretty dramatic changes over the last several decades. So why is the climate changing? This is really Climate Change 101. Without an atmosphere, the global average temperature would be minus 33. Because we have an atmosphere and a natural greenhouse effect, the global average temperature is 15 degrees above zero, so we have a 33 degree climate benefit from a natural greenhouse effect. However, we are now living in a world of an enhanced greenhouse effect because of higher levels of concentrations of greenhouse gases, CO2 being the most spoken about. And that results in greater absorption of the outgoing long wave or infrared radiation by the atmosphere, and that increases the temperature of those atmospheric gases, and they re-emit energy back down to the Earth's surface to raise the temperature of the Earth's surface. And you can see, come the end of that period, 1995, 2014, the global average temperature is something like 15.85 degrees, so almost 1 degree higher than that with a natural greenhouse effect. And of course, we are now seeing global temperatures on average 1 degree above pre-industrial levels. And of course, we're interested in the degree to which we can attribute these changes to human influences. So climate scientists run these so-called attribution experiments, and the flat line here indicates a climate model run just based on so-called natural variability, building in variations in solar radiation, solar energy output, and volcanic eruptions, whereas the upward trending line here is running climate models with natural variability and building in greenhouse gas emissions. And we can see the clear difference between those two trends, and that difference between the natural only and the human influence plus natural, we say is attributed to human influences, so running at about 1 degree above pre-industrial levels. So how about some of the climate change projections? I won't bore you with lots of detailed graphics, but it's very clear from these. Here we have the modelling outputs for 1.5 degree warmer world, 2 degree warmer world, and a 4 degree warmer world. And those projections convey some pretty scary futures for us, with fairly severe increases in temperature, especially in the mid to high latitudes. In the high latitudes here, drastic changes resulted to a result of decreasing snow and ice cover and the so-called positive ice albedo feedback mechanism. And we can also see pretty drastic changes for a 1.5, 2 and 4 degree warmer world in terms of precipitation, with stark increases in some places and decreases in others. As hydrologists and risk managers, we're always interested in probability or return periods, and there's clear evidence that there is going to be a change in return periods. So if you look at temperature, for example, on the left-hand side here, this is for a 1 in 10 year event, taking 1850 to 1900 as our reference period. Under a world 1.5 warmer than pre-industrial levels, what would have occurred once in 10 years will occur just over 4 times in 10 years. So a drastic decrease in the return period, or the probability of extremes. And you can see that for a 50-year event as well. And this graphic just shows the same thing for precipitation. Again, the reference period, 1850 to 1900, 1.5 degree warmer world, and this is for severe precipitation, heavy precipitation events, And what would have occurred in pre-industrial times will occur once in 10 years, will now occur 1.5 times in a 1.5 warmer world. And we can see the same thing for agricultural and ecological drought. So a change in probability of these extremes and therefore the return period. And you're all familiar with these projections for the UK. Last couple of slides. This is for temperature under two scenarios, RCP 2.6 at the top, 8.5, which is the extreme scenario at the bottom. And this is for the average June, July, August, summer temperature across the UK. And this is in terms of percentiles. So this is the 90th percentile in both RCP cases, indicating changes in the top 10% of temperatures. And you can see those extremes are projected to increase somewhere between 6 and 8 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. So a clear shift in the distribution of temperatures. And the same can be said for precipitation. Again, top panel RCP 2.6, bottom panel RCP 2.5, and we can see changes in the extreme temperature events, 90th percentile or more, 50, 40, 50% increase in those totals. So to conclude very quickly, evidence is building that human-induced climate change is changing precipitation and the hydrological cycle, so-called intensification of the hydrological cycle, which results in an increased frequency of extremes. And of course, this holds major implications for managing water resources and water-related ecosystem services at either end of the precipitation spectrum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if you'd like to take a seat at the front, if I can ask the other speakers from this session to come up for the Q&A session. We have quite a few questions to get through, so it's going to be rapid fire, 2 seconds per answer. So, you can tell who's got the first question.
Right. Can I pass it on, though? No?
Yes. Yeah. So there's actually been a lot of questions come in, so I apologise that we're not going to be able to get through all of them, but I'm going to go through the ones which have had the most upvotes. So, David, what do you think the potential is for targeting riparian tree planting to both reduce the temperatures, as you talked about, but also target other pollutants, say in taking out diffuse pollution pathways?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I mean, that's been the basis of all of the work, really, has been to think about how we can make more targeted catchment interventions for the biggest return, if you like. Actually, the other way up, I would sort of answer the question, and that lots of the work that's already gone about has been about dealing with diffuse pollution, and they haven't been thinking about the temperature impacts as well. So I think if we can think about sort of additive value of different interventions, that would be a really good thing to do. And we've actually been talking to forest research about how we can do that. So the opportunity maps that we've created most recently are available through the Shiny app, through the Marine Scotland Science platform. People can go on and have a look at those, and they identify the areas at which you might like to make interventions. The caveat is, and we've got a Royal Society PhD student working on this now, is that river systems, of course, are connected. So if you make interventions, it's like what you do at different points in the catchment, they can have serial effects downstream. So yes, but it's not straightforward and probably quite catchment specific.
Okay. Claire, why do you think the model is overestimating the load from the CSOs?
So Atkins have been developing the model. Atkins have changed the calibration for storm overflows. Obviously, there's not that much data, in fact, almost nothing at all around quality of discharges from storm overflows and almost nothing on flow. So there are a lot of monitors on these now that say they're spilling, but we don't have anything about the load that they're putting in. We don't know why Atkins have changed the calibration. We haven't managed to get that answer from the Environment Agency. We are concerned. It's too late for us to get that calibration changed in this model to help us plan for what we call PR24, so our next planning for our next business plan from 2025. But we will be looking to get an improved calibration in the model to help us develop and work out what interventions we're going to do once the plan is in.
Yeah. Another question for you, Claire. The data that you've collected that you talked about, is that going to be made publicly available?
Yeah, so we're already working with within the Catchment partnerships in both the Brownian and the Skern. We've got steering groups that are supported by, you'll see we had a list of partners flashed up at the end. We have been sharing data openly with those partners who are interested in those catchments, and will continue to do so.
Yeah. Okay. Julia, question for you. How could the hydrological connectivity and stream water quality insights help us make the best catchment management choices?
Yeah, so I guess in the end it's a question of how we can use the amount of money that we have. So if we can link these natural sources and the timing of those natural sources to solutes to the timing where agrochemicals are posing a problem, we can try to trace them back to the original sources, and we can target our management practices there rather than targeting the whole catchment and just basically putting the money where it's important and where it's actually having an effect.
Okay. Next question. Apologies for bouncing around in topics, but next question for Glen, just to move the microphone as much as possible. So, Glen, there's a question coming in. Are there any locations where there are positive climate signals, i.e. mitigation is starting to work?
In short, no.
Okay, I think that's... there was a question for...
But there are plenty of locations where there is no statistically significant trend. But I work on heat waves. There is some evidence that so-called heat wave warning systems or heat health warning systems are having a discernible impact on reducing heat-related deaths. So this is an example of an adaptation strategy as opposed to mitigation. So yeah, there is some evidence that if we do intervene, we can have a discernible impact.
Okay. Thank you. Richard, what relevance does crime have to the NFBI? Have considerations been made around the social generalizations of using census data? I think somebody snuck two questions in there.
Yeah, so crime was in there because there tends to be, it tends to be more focused on deprived neighbourhoods where there's sort of misbehaviour and things. I mean, yeah, it's some have different weightings which feed into the final, and off the top of my head now, because we did it quite some time ago, I can't remember the exact weightings in the model. So it's in there just as a underlying indicator, which you can see whether or not, communities could look at whether or not there's any spatial correlation, any pattern with those that are impacted more greatly by flooding, and whether or not that has any relationship to high levels of crime in an area. It could also be things like where the Environment Agency, I remember saying that where things get deliberately damaged. So if there's defences put in place or things like floodgates on properties, high levels of crime could involve those being damaged.
Yeah. Okay. Just a kind of associated question around some of the detail of the index. Does the Climate Justice consider the ability to escape from a flood for people who live in basements and are at particular risks?
Yeah, so one of the underlying indicators is a census variable is the percentage of properties living in basement or ground floor residential accommodation. So a really interesting one is, I think, London Borough of Sutton that we did some work with. There's one particular neighbourhood where over 95% of the population live in basement. Or people live in, there's 95% of properties have a basement where people live. So yeah, and that's in a flood zone 2 area as well. So yeah, although it doesn't cope, it's not about where, it doesn't provide routes for escape and that kind of thing. That would be a different piece of work, really.
Okay, thank you. David, did you collect any data from urban areas?
So for the national scale modelling work, urban land cover is in there, But actually, a better answer would be some work I didn't present today was the PhD of Danny Krogan, working in Birmingham, which was all about river temperature and urban environment. I mean, it's quite complex, actually. We looked at temperature surges during summer, during sort of convective rainfall, when you might expect water landing on warm pavements resulting in temperature surges. So we saw this up to about 4 degrees occurring across the city of Birmingham, but very much related to, well, what Julie was talking about, connectivity and land use and land cover within that. Be happy to share those papers if you like.
Yeah. Yes, please, of course. Okay. Just let me. I'm aware lunch is the next item. So I'm just checking I've gone through the top questions that have been upvoted. So yeah, final question for you, David. Is river temperature, heat or too much change, something that we should be worrying about here in the northeast of England?
I would say yes. I think when we did the original work, I don't know if you've been worrying about them in Caithness and Sutherland, but you needed to because of the extent of deforestation that's gone on there. So I think the answer is yes. I mean, the question might be, should you be worrying about them in Scotland? People say that, working there. 75% of the genetic stock of Atlantic salmon live there. The rest are in Norway and in Canada. So in terms of the biodiversity, it's incredibly important. In terms of the economy, I said £80 million, but also it links to the justice elements as well. Like there's the cultural value of fishing and fisheries and fish communities is really important. So I think when we deal with these things in relation to Glen's talk as well, it's about not leaving anybody behind. People are adapted to the local environments, and their environments are changing markedly. So I think yes, we should, and yes, we should take action, and yes, you can join us in the Birmingham Institute of Sustainability and Climate Action if you wish.
Okay, thank you. So I'd just like to thank all the speakers from this session. And I think I'll hand over to Becca for directions to lunch.